Imagine waking up on an ordinary morning, going to work, boarding a plane, or walking into your office like any other day. Now imagine that within a few minutes, the world around you begins to collapse. On September 11th, 2001, that is exactly what happened. In less than 2 hours, the United States experienced the deadliest terrorist attack in its history, and the world would never be the same again.
Now, before starting the history, please subscribe my channel. I will pray for you. Now come to the part 1, the morning that began like any other. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the United States woke up to what seemed like a completely ordinary day. In New York City, millions of people were already on their way to work. The city never truly sleeps, and Manhattan was alive with the usual rush of commuters moving through subway stations and crowded sidewalks. Above the skyline stood two massive towers that had become symbols of American economic power, the World Trade Center towers, often called the Twin Towers. Each tower stood more than 1,300 feet tall. From their upper floors, people could see the entire city stretching out in every direction. On clear mornings like that Tuesday, the view reached all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Thousands of employees were already inside the towers. Bankers, office workers, security staff, restaurant employees, tourists visiting the observation deck. Nobody inside those buildings had any idea that within a few hours, the towers would no longer exist. A quiet morning in America. Across the country, life moved at its usual pace. In Washington, D.C., government workers began arriving at the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense. In Boston, several flights prepared for departure from Logan International Airport. Passengers boarded planes, stowed luggage in overhead bins, and waited for takeoff. For most travelers, it was simply another business trip. No one realized that several of those flights were about to become part of one of the most devastating events in modern history. The flights that changed history. 4 airplanes took off that morning, carrying passengers who believed they were heading toward routine destinations. The planes were American Airlines Flight 11, United Airlines Flight 175, American Airlines Flight 77, and United Airlines Flight 93. Shortly after takeoff, something terrifying happened. Hijackers took control of the aircraft. Armed with small knives and simple weapons, they forced their way into the cockpits. The pilots were overpowered. The planes were now under the control of terrorists. At first, air traffic controllers were confused. Planes occasionally lose communication with the ground, but what was happening now was different. One aircraft suddenly stopped responding. Another changed direction unexpectedly. Controllers began to realize something was very wrong. The first impact. At 8:46 a.m., the first plane crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the building at nearly 500 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. Fuel from the airplane exploded into a massive fireball. Flames burst from the sides of the tower. Hundreds of people were trapped above the impact zone. Below, chaos spread across the streets of Manhattan. People looked up at the burning tower in disbelief. They believed it must have been a terrible accident, but within minutes, another plane appeared. The second plane. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower. Millions of people were watching live news coverage by that point. Cameras were already focused on the burning North Tower when the second plane struck. The explosion was captured on live television. At that moment, the world realized something terrifying. This was not an accident. America was under attack.
Panic across the nation. Inside the towers, thousands of people tried to escape. Firefighters rushed into the buildings to rescue those trapped inside. Police officers directed crowds away from the area. Helicopters circled above the towers. But the fires inside the buildings were growing stronger. Jet fuel had ignited entire floors. Steel beams began to weaken under the extreme heat. Meanwhile, another plane was heading toward Washington. The Pentagon attack. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. The explosion tore through part of the building. Thick black smoke rose into the sky above the Capitol. By now, it was clear that the United States was experiencing the largest terrorist attack in its history. Airports across the country were ordered to shut down. All airplanes in the sky were instructed to land immediately. But one more hijacked plane was still in the air. The passengers who fought back. United Airlines Flight 93 had been hijacked like the others, but the passengers aboard this plane learned about the attacks through phone calls to their families. They realized the terrorists intended to crash the aircraft into another major target, possibly the U.S. Capitol or the White House. Instead of waiting helplessly, the passengers made a decision. They would fight back. The passengers attempted to overpower the hijackers. A struggle broke out inside the plane. At 10:03 a.m., the aircraft crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Everyone aboard the plane died, but their actions likely prevented another devastating attack. The collapse of the towers. Back in New York, the fires inside the World Trade Center towers were becoming uncontrollable. Thousands of firefighters were still inside the buildings, attempting to rescue trapped workers. Then, at 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. The entire structure fell in less than 10 seconds. A massive cloud of dust and debris spread across Manhattan. Streets disappeared beneath gray smoke. Then, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed as well. The skyline of New York City had been permanently changed. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives in the attacks. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. A nation in shock. Across the United States, millions of people watched the events unfold on television. Schools closed, businesses shut down. Air travel across the country stopped completely. For the first time in modern history, American airspace was almost entirely empty. President George W. Bush addressed the nation later that evening. His message was simple but powerful. America would respond, and the world would soon enter a new era defined by the fight against terrorism. Part 2. The investigation that shook the world. The hours after the attacks of September 11th were filled with confusion, fear, and disbelief. Emergency crews rushed to the destroyed areas in New York and Washington. Thousands of firefighters, police officers, and rescue workers searched through burning rubble for survivors. But the damage was unlike anything the country had ever experienced. Entire buildings had collapsed. Huge clouds of smoke covered lower Manhattan. People wandered through the streets covered in gray dust from the fallen towers. Families across America were desperately trying to contact loved ones who had been inside the buildings or on the planes. The United States had suddenly entered one of the darkest moments in its history. But almost immediately, the government began asking one urgent question: who was responsible for the attacks? The first clues. Investigators from the FBI, CIA, and other intelligence agencies began examining the evidence. Airline passenger lists were analyzed. Airport security footage was reviewed. Phone calls made from the planes were studied. Within hours, authorities had already identified several of the hijackers. They were connected to a terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda. This group had been responsible for previous attacks against American targets. The leader of Al-Qaeda was a man named Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden had once fought against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan during the 1980s, but over time he had become deeply hostile toward the United States and its presence in the Middle East. American intelligence agencies had been aware of Al-Qaeda for years. However, the scale of the September 11th attacks was far greater than anything previously imagined. The world responds. As news of the attacks spread across the globe, leaders from many countries expressed shock and support for the United States. Nations that had previously disagreed with American policies still condemned the attacks. Even longtime geopolitical rivals offered condolences. For the first time in its history, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, invoked Article 5, declaring that an attack against one member nation was an attack against all. This meant the United States would not stand alone. The international community recognized that the attacks had changed the world. The beginning of the War on Terror. Only a few weeks after the attacks, the United States launched a military campaign known as the War on Terror. The first target was Afghanistan. American intelligence believed the Taliban government in Afghanistan was protecting Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda leaders. In October 2001, U.S. forces began military operations in the region. American aircraft bombed Taliban positions. Special forces worked alongside Afghan fighters to remove the Taliban from power. Within months, the Taliban government collapsed. However, Osama bin Laden managed to escape into the mountains along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The hunt for him would continue for nearly a decade. Life in America after 9/11. Inside the United States, daily life changed dramatically. Airports introduced strict new security measures. Passengers now had to pass through metal detectors and baggage screening. Cockpit doors on airplanes were reinforced. A new government agency called the Department of Homeland Security was created to coordinate national security efforts. Americans also became more aware of the threat of terrorism. The attacks had shown that even the most powerful country in the world could be vulnerable. Many people felt fear, but at the same time there was also a strong sense of unity. Across the country, American flags appeared on homes, businesses, and cars. Communities held memorial services for the victims. People donated money to support the families affected by the attacks. In the midst of tragedy, Americans were determined to stand together. The hunt for Osama bin Laden. For years after the attacks, finding Osama bin Laden became one of the most important missions for U.S. intelligence agencies. Thousands of intelligence officers worked to track down his location. Military forces searched remote regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan, but bin Laden remained hidden. He communicated with his followers through secret couriers. Electronic communication was rarely used because it could be traced. The search became one of the most complex intelligence operations in modern history. Then, nearly 10 years after the attacks, a breakthrough occurred. The secret operation. American intelligence had identified a suspicious compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The building was unusually secure. High walls surrounded the property. The residents rarely left the compound. There were no phone or internet connections. Investigators began to suspect that someone extremely important might be hiding there. After months of surveillance, President Barack Obama authorized a secret military operation. On the night of May 2, 2011, a team of U.S. Navy SEALs flew into Pakistan aboard stealth helicopters. They entered the compound and searched the buildings. Inside, they found Osama bin Laden. The al-Qaeda leader was killed during the raid. After nearly a decade of searching, the man responsible for the 9/11 attacks had finally been located. A moment of closure. When the news was announced, crowds gathered outside the White House and at Ground Zero in New York. People celebrated the end of a long manhunt. For many families who had lost loved ones in the attacks, the moment brought a sense of closure. But the events of September 11th had already reshaped American history. The attacks had changed global politics. They had led to wars in multiple countries, and they had transformed the way nations approached security and terrorism. A new era. The years following 9/11 became defined by the struggle against terrorism. American troops remained in Afghanistan for 20 decades. Military operations continued in various parts of the Middle East. At home, intelligence agencies expanded their efforts to detect potential threats. The attacks had shown how interconnected and vulnerable the modern world could be. But they also demonstrated something else: the resilience of a nation determined to recover. Part 3. The Day America Changed Forever. In the days following the attacks, the United States was still in shock. The images of collapsing towers, burning buildings, and desperate rescue efforts were replayed on television screens across the world. For many Americans, it felt impossible to understand how something like this could happen. The attacks had not taken place in a distant war zone. They had happened in the heart of major American cities, and they had been broadcast live to the entire world. Ground Zero. In New York City, the site where the World Trade Center once stood became known as Ground Zero. What had once been two massive skyscrapers was now a field of twisted steel and smoking rubble. Rescue teams worked around the clock, searching for survivors beneath the debris. Firefighters, police officers, construction workers, volunteers, everyone worked together in dangerous conditions. The air was thick with dust from the destroyed buildings. Heavy machinery slowly moved pieces of steel and concrete in hopes of finding anyone still alive. But as the days passed, hope began to fade. The rescue mission slowly turned into a recovery operation. The heroes of that day. While the attacks caused enormous tragedy, they also revealed extraordinary acts of courage. Firefighters rushed into the burning towers, knowing the buildings might collapse. Police officers helped thousands of people escape through dark stairwells filled with smoke. Ordinary civilians also became heroes. In New York, strangers helped guide injured people to safety. Boat captains used ferries and private boats to evacuate thousands from Manhattan across the Hudson River. In Washington, Pentagon employees helped rescue colleagues trapped inside the damaged building. And in Pennsylvania, the passengers aboard Flight 93 made the ultimate sacrifice by fighting the hijackers. Their actions likely saved hundreds of lives on the ground. Across the country, Americans began referring to these individuals simply as heroes. Rebuilding the city. New York City faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding the destroyed area. The loss of the Twin Towers had left a massive gap in the skyline. For months, engineers and workers cleared debris from the site. Eventually, the city began planning a new structure that would replace the fallen towers. The goal was not only to rebuild, it was to create a symbol of resilience. The new building would be called One World Trade Center. Construction began years later and required enormous engineering effort. When it was completed in 2014, the tower stood 1,776 feet tall. The number was chosen deliberately. It represented the year 1776, when the United States declared independence. The building became a powerful reminder that the country would not be defeated by acts of terror.
The memorial. Alongside the new tower, a memorial was created to honor the victims. The 9/11 Memorial includes two large reflecting pools built in the exact locations where the Twin Towers once stood. Water flows continuously into the center of each pool. Around the edges are engraved the names of the nearly 3,000 people who died in the attacks. Visitors from around the world come to the memorial each year. Some come to pay respects to loved ones. Others come to remember the events of that tragic day. The site has become one of the most important places of remembrance in modern American history. Security in a new world. The attacks of September 11th permanently changed how security works in the United States. Air travel, in particular, was transformed. Before 2001, airport security was relatively simple. Passengers could bring many items on planes without much screening. Family members could even walk directly to the departure gates. After the attacks, new security systems were introduced. The Transportation Security Administration, TSA, was created to oversee airport security. Passengers now pass through metal detectors and full-body scanners. Luggage is carefully inspected. Cockpit doors on airplanes are reinforced to prevent hijackers from entering. While these changes sometimes make travel slower, they were designed to prevent another attack like 9/11. The Long Wars. The War on Terror launched after the attacks led to long military conflicts. American forces remained in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years. The mission was originally focused on defeating al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban government that had supported them. But over time, the conflict became more complicated. The United States attempted to help build a stable Afghan government. Thousands of American soldiers served in the region. Many lost their lives during the conflict. The war became one of the longest in American history. In 2021, U.S. forces officially withdrew from Afghanistan. The global impact. The attacks of September 11th did not only affect the United States, they reshaped global politics. Many countries strengthened their own counterterrorism policies. Intelligence sharing between nations increased dramatically. Airports across the world adopted stricter security procedures. Governments began focusing more heavily on preventing extremist groups from carrying out attacks. The world had entered a new era where terrorism became one of the central challenges of international security. The legacy of 9/11. More than 2 decades have passed since the attacks, yet the memory of that day remains deeply connected to American identity. Every year on September 11th, memorial ceremonies are held across the country. Moments of silence mark the exact times when the planes struck the towers and the Pentagon. Families gather to remember loved ones who were lost. For younger generations who were not alive in 2001, the events of that day are often learned through history lessons, documentaries, and stories from those who witnessed it. But for millions of Americans who experienced the attacks firsthand, the memories remain vivid. They remember exactly where they were when they heard the news. They remember watching the towers collapse, and they remember the feeling that the world had suddenly changed. A nation that endures. Despite the tragedy, the United States endured. Cities were rebuilt, communities supported one another, and the country continued moving forward. The attacks of September 11th were meant to create fear and destruction, but they also revealed something powerful about the American spirit. Even in the face of immense tragedy, the nation chose resilience. And that resilience became one of the lasting legacies of the day America changed forever. Part 4. America enters a new era. After the attacks of September 11th, the United States was no longer the same country it had been just days earlier. The sense of safety that many Americans had taken for granted had suddenly disappeared. For the first time in modern history, a massive attack had been carried out directly on American soil by foreign terrorists. The country now faced a difficult question. How could something like this be prevented from ever happening again? The answer would reshape American policy, military strategy, and global politics for the next 2 decades. The creation of Homeland Security. One of the most significant changes after the attacks was the creation of a new government department. In 2002, the United States established the Department of Homeland Security. It became one of the largest federal agencies in the country. Its mission was simple but enormous: protect the United States from future terrorist attacks. The new department combined several existing agencies into a single organization. These included Immigration Services, Border Security, Emergency Management, and Transportation Security. The goal was to improve communication and coordination between agencies responsible for national security. Before 9/11, many intelligence organizations operated separately. Information that might have prevented the attacks had sometimes been scattered between different agencies. Homeland Security was created to prevent those gaps from happening again. The Patriot Act. In the weeks after the attacks, the U.S. government also passed new laws to strengthen intelligence operations. One of the most controversial pieces of legislation was the USA Patriot Act. The law expanded the ability of intelligence agencies to monitor communications and investigate suspected terrorists. Supporters believed the law was necessary to prevent future attacks. They argued that modern terrorist networks operated across borders and used advanced technology to plan attacks. Critics, however, worried that the law gave the government too much surveillance power. They feared it might threaten civil liberties and privacy. The debate over security versus freedom became one of the defining political discussions of the post-9/11 era. The war expands. After the initial invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the United States soon became involved in another major conflict. In 2003, American forces launched a military operation against Iraq. The U.S. government believed that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a potential threat to global security. The invasion quickly removed Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein from power. However, the conflict soon turned into a long and complicated war. Insurgent groups fought against coalition forces. Violence spread across the country. Over the next several years, thousands of soldiers and civilians were killed. The Iraq War became one of the most debated military operations in modern American history. Some argued it was necessary for national security. Others believed it diverted attention and resources away from the fight against Al-Qaeda. America at home. While wars continued overseas, life inside the United States also changed in many ways. Americans became more aware of global politics and security threats. News coverage frequently focused on international conflicts and terrorism. At the same time, American society showed remarkable resilience. Businesses reopened in New York. The city rebuilt its financial district. New construction projects began across the country. Technology companies were transforming the economy.
The early 2000s saw rapid growth in the internet and digital technology. Companies like Google, Amazon, and Apple were beginning to reshape how people worked, communicated, and lived. Even as the country faced difficult challenges, it continued moving forward.
Remembering the victims. Every year on September 11th, memorial ceremonies are held across the United States. At the 9/11 Memorial in New York, the names of the victims are read aloud. Family members gather around the reflecting pools. Moments of silence mark the exact times when the plane struck the towers in the Pentagon. Similar ceremonies take place in Washington and Pennsylvania. For many Americans, the day has become one of remembrance, a day to honor those who lost their lives, and a day to recognize the courage shown by firefighters, police officers, and ordinary citizens during the crisis. The next generation. More than 20 years have now passed since the attacks. For younger generations, September 11th is something they know primarily through history books, documentaries, and the stories told by older relatives. But the effects of that day are still visible. Airport security remains strict. International counter-terrorism efforts continue. And the events of 9/11 continue to influence global politics. Students studying American history often learn about the attacks as one of the defining events of the early 21st century. Much like Pearl Harbor in 1941, September 11th marked a turning point in the nation's history. The end of the longest war. In 2021, the United States officially withdrew its remaining military forces from Afghanistan. The withdrawal marked the end of the longest war in American history. For many Americans, it represented the closing of a chapter that began nearly 20 years earlier on September 11, 2001. The war had cost thousands of lives and billions of dollars. But it had also shaped an entire generation of soldiers and citizens who lived through the era defined by the War on Terror. A defining moment in history. Looking back today, historians often describe the attacks of September 11th as one of the most important moments in modern American history. The event reshaped international relations. It changed how governments approach security and intelligence. It influenced military strategy across the world. And it left a permanent mark on American society. Yet the story of that day is not only about tragedy. It is also about resilience. Communities came together, cities rebuilt, and the country continued moving forward. The events of September 11th remind the world that history is often shaped by moments that no one expects, moments that suddenly change the direction of nations and the lives of millions of people.
Part 5. The Long Shadow of September 11th, 2001. As the years passed after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, the world slowly began to understand the full impact of that day. What had started as a series of coordinated terrorist attacks quickly became one of the most significant turning points in modern history. For the United States, it reshaped foreign policy, military strategy, intelligence operations, and even daily life for millions of people. But beyond politics and security, the events of that day also left a powerful emotional legacy that continues to influence the country today. A nation united. In the days immediately following the attacks, Americans experienced an unusual sense of unity. Political disagreements that had once dominated the national conversation suddenly seemed less important. People from different backgrounds, religions, and political beliefs stood together. Across the country, communities organized blood drives, charity events, and memorial services. American flags appeared everywhere. They hung from homes, storefronts, cars, and public buildings. The flag became a symbol of resilience. It represented the belief that the country would endure despite the tragedy. Even in places far from New York or Washington, people felt personally connected to the events of that day, because the attacks had targeted not only buildings and people, but also the sense of security that Americans had long believed in. The stories of the survivors. Many of the most powerful memories of September 11th come from the people who survived. Office workers trapped inside the towers described long, dark stairwells filled with smoke as they attempted to escape. Firefighters climbing upward past thousands of civilians descending toward safety. Some survivors spoke of moments of incredible kindness. Strangers helped each other navigate through the chaos. People carried injured coworkers down dozens of flights of stairs. Others guided blind or disabled colleagues through smoke-filled hallways. In Washington, the Pentagon workers helped rescue people trapped in the damaged sections of the building. And in Pennsylvania, the bravery of the passengers aboard Flight 93 became one of the most inspiring stories of the entire day. Their decision to resist the hijackers likely prevented another devastating attack on the U.S. Capitol or the White House. The global memory. The attacks also left a lasting impression around the world. For millions of people outside the United States, the events of September 11th were the first time they had witnessed such a large-scale terrorist attack in real time. Television broadcasts carried the images of the burning towers to nearly every country on Earth. People in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America watched the events unfold as if they were happening in their own cities. Memorials and moments of silence were held in many countries. International leaders visited New York to pay tribute to the victims. The attacks had become not just an American tragedy, but a global one. The transformation of intelligence and security. One of the lasting changes after 9/11 occurred within the world of intelligence and security. Governments began investing far more resources into detecting potential terrorist threats. International intelligence cooperation expanded dramatically. Countries began sharing information about suspected extremist groups and individuals. Technology also played an increasingly important role. Data analysis, surveillance systems, and digital communication monitoring became central tools in counterterrorism efforts. These changes were intended to prevent attacks before they could occur. However, they also sparked ongoing debates about privacy and civil liberties. The balance between security and freedom became one of the most important political discussions of the 21st century. Rebuilding Ground Zero. Perhaps the most visible symbol of resilience in the United States was the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site. For years after the attacks, construction crews worked to transform the destroyed area into a new space for remembrance and renewal. The centerpiece of this effort was One World Trade Center. When completed, the tower became the tallest building in the United States. Its height of 1,776 feet was chosen to symbolize the year of American independence. The building stands as a reminder that even after tragedy, the nation continues to rebuild and move forward. Nearby, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum preserves the history of the attacks. Inside the museum are artifacts recovered from the site, including pieces of steel from the towers, damaged emergency vehicles, and personal items belonging to victims. The museum tells the stories of those who lost their lives and those who risked everything to help others. The generation that grew up after 9/11.
For Americans who were children in 2001 or who were born afterward, the attacks are now part of history rather than personal memory. Yet the effects of that day continue to shape their world. Airport security procedures, military conflicts in the Middle East, counterterrorism policies. All of these developments trace their origins back to the events of September 11th. Schools teach students about the attacks as one of the defining events of the early 21st century. Documentaries and books continue to examine the details of the day and its consequences. In many ways, September 11th became a dividing line in modern history. People often describe events as happening either before 9/11 or after 9/11. The enduring message. More than 2 decades later, the story of September 11th remains a powerful reminder of both tragedy and resilience. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives that day. Thousands of families were forever changed. But the attacks also revealed extraordinary courage and compassion. Firefighters and police officers rushed into danger to save others. Ordinary citizens helped strangers escape collapsing buildings. Passengers on Flight 93 chose to fight back rather than surrender to terror. These acts of bravery became an enduring part of the story. History's turning point. Historians often describe certain events as turning points, moments that permanently change the direction of nations. For the United States, September 11th was one of those moments. The attacks reshaped foreign policy. They influenced military conflicts across the world. They transformed national security systems, and they altered the way people think about safety, freedom, and global cooperation. Yet, even in the face of such profound change, the United States continued to move forward. Cities rebuilt, communities recovered, and the country remained committed to the ideals that had shaped its history for more than 2 centuries. The story continues. History never truly ends. Every generation adds new chapters to the story of a nation. The events of September 11th will always remain one of the most significant chapters in American history. They remind us how fragile peace can be. But they also remind us how powerful resilience can be when people come together in times of crisis. And in that sense, the legacy of that day is not only about loss, it is also about the